In this new generation, there are so many different ways that can help us learn a new language. And one of those ways is to listen to podcasts. So in this video, I will share some of the best podcasts that can help you learn English. I will tell you a bit about those podcasts and where you can find them. So let's begin. Now, just a quick point before we look at the podcast is, where can you find these podcasts? So all these podcasts, I will leave the links in the description below, but you can also find them on any platform where they host podcasts. So for example, Spotify, Amazon Music, or even Apple Podcasts. So it does not matter whether you are an Apple user or an Android user. I will leave the links below. Now, let's get started with the first podcast, and that is Espresso English. So Espresso English is a great podcast to help you start your journey in learning English. Now, this podcast, I would say, is for beginners and is really good at breaking down things that people usually get confused with. For example, they might break down the differences between adjectives and adverbs. And it's also great if you're struggling with grammar, for example, which tends to use. Oh, and another great thing about Espresso English is that they usually answer commonly asked questions. So questions that you might have, the chances are that they will have probably answered those questions in this podcast. So I'll leave the link in the description below. And now let's move on to the second podcast. These podcasts, by the way, are in no particular order, but the second one is Coffee Break English. So again, it's a similar name to do with coffee. And each episode, by the way, lasts for around 15 minutes. So they're not that long. And if you just listen to a podcast regularly, it will help you in your journey of improving your English. 15 minutes isn't a lot of time. And remember, the benefit of podcast is that you can do this in the background. You can do it passively. So you can listen to a podcast when you're driving or when you're in the gym. It's not like you have to sit down at your desk and then listen to it and make notes. You can just listen to it in the background of you doing anything that you're normally doing, for example, cooking. Anyways, I'm getting off the point here. Another thing about this podcast is that they speak to native English speakers in each episode. And when they speak, they often speak about life or culture. And the second half of the podcast, they usually focus on different themes or language. And this podcast is a great podcast for beginners again. And the reason for that is because they speak in very slow English. So it is very easy to understand. So if you're a beginner or you just like listening to people speak in slow English, then this podcast is for you. Now let's move on to the third podcast on our list, and that is All Is English podcast. So this podcast, this is more so designed for intermediate level students, and this is one of the more popular podcasts out there. So the hosts of this podcast, they are both ESL teachers. ESL, by the way, it stands for English as a Second Language. So the co-hosts, they are trained in teaching English to those students who are learning English as a second or third or fourth language. So students just like you who already speak one language and now they're learning a new language. So this podcast, again, is very popular and is great for somebody who is at intermediate level. And furthermore, one of the reasons why this podcast is so popular is because they cover a wide range of topics. For example, they might train you on how to do well in a job interview, and they even have a separate section that can prepare students for the IELTS exam. So again, this podcast is great for English learners, especially at intermediate level. Okay, now the next podcast, this one is an interesting one, and it is called Stories Podcast. So, as you can tell by the name, in this podcast, what they do is they go through different stories. So the benefit of Stories Podcast that not many other podcasts have, this one's quite special in that case, is that they don't focus too much on teaching you. You can actually learn more from this podcast through just engaging with the story, and that's a great benefit. So if you've watched my previous videos, I always talk about how watching TV shows or listening to something that you enjoy can help you improve your English, and that is what this podcast allows you to do. It helps you learn through listening to stories. So if you like reading about stories or listening about stories, then this podcast is for you. And now let's talk about the next podcast on our list, and that is called English Across the Pond. Now, across the pond basically means on the other side of the world. So it's a quite special name here, and that is because the co-hosts are across the pond. So one is from the UK, I believe, and the other host is from America. So they are across the pond. And the great thing about this podcast is that lots of people out there, you might be included in this, they often have this question: which style of English should they learn? Should they follow British English or should they follow American English? Okay, to be honest with you, there's not much difference, but if you have asked yourself this question in the past, you don't need to worry with this podcast, because they go through both British English and American English, and that's the beauty of this podcast. So again, check out these podcasts. Let me know which one you like. If you want more information about these podcasts, I will leave a link in the description below. And if you're new to this channel, my name is Brick. I'm a qualified English teacher and an IELTS trainer from the UK. And on this channel, we cover everything IELTS related. So if that's something that you're interested in, consider subscribing, and I'll see you in the next video. Bye-bye.